Good morning and welcome once again to Talkback, the People's Program presented as an area service of your friends and neighbors at the Edwards Division of the Bates Manufacturing Company. Some mornings we're concerned with a two-way interview discussion with people and places of interest, and on other days the open phone line provides opportunity for listeners to quiz our guest by dialing Talkback at Mayfair 33878. This morning's Talkback program is recorded and unfortunately closed from the standpoint of listenership participation. I say unfortunately because our guest of the morning is an interesting personality whom I'm sure many of you would like to talk with. For a long time, he had his own coast-to-coast network programs involved with poetry and broadcast pilgrimages to famous sites of literature in the United States. In my days before getting into the broadcast business, I always enjoyed programs with Ted Malone produced and conducted, and I'm sure that this evening is a reflection of our general audience. In a moment, we'll be speaking with Ted Malone, his career in broadcasting, and some of the fascinating challenges which are ahead in this business. The Edwards Division of the Bates Manufacturing Company pays tribute to one of our youth groups known as Junior Achievement. One of its purposes is to provide an educational program for future employers, employees, and voters by creating in them an awareness of the value of the free enterprise system. It is a program open to any youth interested in learning about the American economic system. Through this educational program, youngsters of today learn the fundamentals which have made our American economic system so successful. It is actually a program of learning by doing. High school juniors and seniors are organized into small corporate enterprises which operate under adult supervision. They enroll 20 to 25 students as members of the corporation and select a product to manufacture and distribute. They elect company officers and capitalize their company with between $100 and $300 of initial capitalization sold by themselves at 50 cents a share. This is just the beginning. They go through the maneuvers of any business with the ultimate purpose of creating a profit. Learning by doing is one of the sound areas of operation through Junior Achievement. A salute from the Edwards Division of Bates. Between the Bookends was one of radio shows which made familiar the name of Ted Malone to thousands of listeners in the United States. Although not on network radio today, Ted has in recent years been heard in syndicated features throughout the country, and just a few years ago was a regular morning visitor via WFAU radio through the courtesy of Depositors Trust. It was a fascinating series and one which we hope could be renewed as a daily journey with a man of many interests. Ted, isn't it also true that within recent years you've become somewhat of a frequent visitor here to our state of Maine?
Oh, yes, Norm. We come up here quite often and have a wonderful time on every visit we've ever made to Maine.
Well, you have some actual background ties here because I believe that your daughter married a Maine boy, huh?
Yes, but I'm really not going to hold that against Maine just because he came along and took my daughter. But we've really, before they ever met, we've been coming up to Maine to visit a friend of ours, Carlton Brown, up in Waterville. We used to go down to Pemaquid Point, down to Damerscotty, down to South Bristol, down to Thompson Inn down there, and down to Christmas Cove. Now we go down to Tickleside, so that we felt that we've sort of gotten acquainted with the Maine folks, and maybe that's where my daughter got interested in the Maine folks that developed her interest in this young chap out at Northwestern University when she married a boy from Rumford.
Right from my hometown, and I remember the family well because they ran a hardware store up there
That's
for
right.
many years, Ted.
That's right. Cappy Dunn. We always had a problem because her name has always been Happy, and his nickname has always been Cappy. So when they wanted to get married, they wanted to put on their wedding announcement from Happy and Cappy, and we said that won't go. We said it's got to be more dignified than that.
Well, how about have you any grandchildren?
Well, not by that particular marriage, but by my other daughter.
Yeah.
We have two little girls and a boy. So that we're in the grandparent class, all right, the golden age group to come. Not quite, but we're looking over for the hill. It won't be too far away. And we're, of course, expecting the Maine folks to produce something, too.
Yeah. You sound in some of your words here as though you were going into retirement, but I don't think Ted Malone will ever go into retirement. It seems to me that even after you get out of some very active days in the radio business, that you've been actually involved in a lot of other side things. And speak about these radio days, how about going back to some of the things that you did in network radio? Between the Bookends was one of the big shows, wasn't it?
Yes, and you might say, Norm, in the light of your opening remarks there, that I got into Between the Bookends learning by doing. Because I'll never forget the first program that we ever had was back in Kansas City Oh, many, many years ago, longer than I'm going to admit at the moment. But the station manager called me. I was working in the continuity department, and he says, "Hey, come on in and fill in. Our show isn't coming through today, and we don't have something to go on, so fill in." And I said, "What can I do?" And he says, "Come on in and read a book." And I said, "You can't read a book in 15 minutes." And he said, "Well, read some poetry." And I said, "I will not. I grew up in this town. They're not going to call me a sissy." So he says, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll call you by some other name." Well, I thought a minute, and I said, all right, all right. So we went into the studio, and he said, "The next program will come to you announced by Ted Malone." I nodded my head, yes. I don't know did you know, Norm, my name isn't Ted Malone?
No, I didn't.
All right, you're finding out something right now.
Yeah.
So my name is Alden Russell. That's
Alden
my real
Russell.
name. That's
Ah.
right. So my daughter's Happy Russell. See that way.
I
Well,
see.
anyway, I read poetry that day, and it was just before St. Patrick's Day.
Mm-hmm.
We began to get letters that said, "Dear Ted Malone." Soon as I heard that name Malone, I knew you were a witty Irishman. Well, that was a head start before I started talking.
Yeah, I can all see
So
that.
I just kept the name Malone, and it has gone through the years. It's been wonderful, excepting on those occasions when my wife and I go someplace, and maybe, for instance, now the day we arrived at a hotel, the St. Francis in San Francisco, and we were to meet out there. I was coming in from Japan, and she came out from New York, and we were to meet. So we weren't quite sure exactly what time we would both arrive.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Well, you check in when you get there. I'll check in when I get there, and we'll meet." So when I arrived, she told me she had already arrived, and she said, "Oh, I'm very embarrassed." I said, "What happened?" She said, "I was down at the desk, and I asked them if Alden Russell had checked in yet, and she said, the man behind the counter said, 'No, he isn't here. We don't have any Alden Russell. There's no Russell listed here.' She said, 'Well, I guess I got here first.' So she said, 'I checked in, Verlia Russell,' that's her name. And then she said, just as I finished writing it on the slip there, I said, 'Oh, wait a minute. Has Ted Malone checked in?' And they said, 'Yes, he came in about an hour ago.' She said, 'Well, you just put me in his room.' And they says, 'No, ma'am, we don't do that here.' Well, it took a whole week to convince her and to convince him that everything was, So we've had that little problem all through our lives. When we take our trips to Europe now on our travels of the Constitution, she always goes as Mrs. Russell because that's the way her passport is, but I go as Ted Malone because as the travel lecturer, I'm supposed to be Ted Malone. Therefore, the steward always looks at us with a kind of a fishy eye. How does it come, But we try to make it clear to everybody that Malone and Russell are the same thing,
I see.
and that everything is all right.
Yeah, well, I can see where it'd be an area of a little difficulty here, and some explanation
That's right.
necessary. You speak about travel here and tours as such. Tell us about that, Ted.
Oh, one of the wonderful things of radio, as you well know, Norm, is that these days with tape and all that makes possible, there's a flexibility in radio that makes it possible for a fellow to tape his shows and go off on a trip. And about a year and a half ago, I found out that on the cruise ships to Europe, in fact, down to the Mediterranean, down South America, all around, they usually have what they call travel lecturers. Now, he's a fellow who goes aboard the ship and says, now, tomorrow we'll arrive in Casablanca. And if you're going to stop here in Morocco or going up to Rabat or down there, here what you're going to see at the souk or the old Medina or like that, and tell them all about Casablanca.
Yeah.
Next day Gibraltar, next day Mallorca, next day Naples and Genoa and around that. So I said to them, well, I'm just the man you've been looking for. I love to travel, and I'll find you good stories on all these things. So that now my wife and I make 3 or 4 trips a year around on the usually on the ship, the Constitution, as the travel people. And at the same time, I take along my tape recorders, and I record the people in Casablanca or in Gibraltar or down in Naples. And we've had some things that we think are fun. For instance, when we were in London, I think you'll get a kick out of this, Norm, when we always, tried to find something a little different. And therefore, because as you know in other fields, I'm interested very much in recording sound, everybody's heard Big Ben strike, the big clock in London.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, now we've got to get a different twist on this somewhere or other. So we took our recorder and climbed up to the top of the tower and recorded Big Ben ticking.
Yeah.
Now, not very many people on this earth have heard Big Ben tick.
No.
But we recorded
It's a loud tick, isn't it?
In fact, it ticks once every 2 seconds.
Is that so?
Because it's such a big pendulum that it swings in an interval that makes it once every 2 seconds. I had one other recording incident that I loved very much, too, that I had fun with. When we were in Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem was what are you going to record here? Because it doesn't make any sound. It doesn't creak yet. It may.
I understand it's beginning to creak a little. Tell
just
me, huh?
about, all right. But I thought to myself, what sort of a sound can we record here? And then I had an inspiration. I remembered that the Tower of Pisa was used by Galileo to drop the falling objects.
Yes.
Measure
yes,
the
yes.
speed of falling
Yeah.
objects.
Yeah, I remember that in science class.
That's
in
right.
High school.
So I sent my wife across the street to a little food market, and she bought 3 apples in a sack and came back over and climbed to the top of the Tower of Pisa and dropped the first apple. I stayed down at the bottom. She still thinks that I deliberately sent her to the top. Anyway, I stayed down there and got where the apple hit.
Mm-hmm.
There was a good crunch.
I
see?
would imagine
So
so.
then we have we took the next 2 apples, and we have the sound of falling objects from the top of the Tower of Pisa, which nobody's heard since Galileo.
You know, this is a fascinating thing. Ted, I'm going to take 60 seconds out here, and we've got the commercial that comes in at this particular point. We'll be
good.
back, and I want to ask more about these recording sessions that you had, because I can see where you really must have a ball going around the country here. Just recently, we were reading of a columnist's complaint in regards to today's inferior merchandise, as aptly termed junk parts, that years ago wouldn't have been given house room. Perhaps this analysis has some instance of truth, but we can think of one category in which there has been no downgrade of quality. That's in the textile industry bearing the Bates label. In our own local Edwards division, the story has been one of continuing improvement of quality, a program of progress resulting in superior merchandise for manufacturer to retailer. This fine quality is expressed in textile linings for winter wear, in the padded insides of a silver chest, or the warmth-giving qualities of a sleeping bag. These uses for a Bates quality product are but a few of the many ways in which the company has put the output of its mills to work for the general public. That Bates products are universally recognized is a tribute to the worker and to the continuing effort to upgrade this miracle of the loom. Our guest of the morning, Mr. Ted Malone of, I want to say, between the Bookends
That's right.
fame. And Ted is with us this morning on a recorded discussion, so our listeners are out from the standpoint of asking questions. Ted, getting back to this bit here, you've been doing some interesting experiments in recording. There's one project that I think that I want to get into a little depth here. You're working right now with the National Association of Broadcasters in a highly fascinating project, one which is that of capturing sound.
Yes, actually, Norm, it really developed over the fact that 80 years ago, there was no sound recorded anywhere in the world. 80 years ago, nobody had ever heard of a way of recording any kind of sound. And then Edison developed his old tinfoil cylinder and found that he could record the voice. And by the way, the first sound ever recorded by any man anywhere at any time under any circumstances was a poem. Edison himself recited "Mary Had a Little Lamb," and that was the beginning of recording. Well, since then, there has been, of course, gradually increasing amounts of recording up until about 1945 to 1950, when the tape came into use, and then it exploded. We talk of population explosions, information explosions. There was a tape explosion, you might say, and now there are literally millions of tape recorders all over the world. There are more recordings being made today than anybody can even calculate. And we got to thinking about the fact that the original recordings between 1880 and 1945 had never been cataloged, never been indexed, never been gathered, so that while we can go to the Library of Congress, for example, and find information on almost every book that has ever been published from the Gutenberg Bible forward, that there is no place on this whole earth today where we can really go for information as to the location of all kinds of early recordings. We found out that many of the networks, which we would imagine would have old recordings of their early shows, had literally thrown them out. Two of the major networks have no recordings whatsoever now today. They have not kept any. It took too much space, and so they just disposed of it all. Some of them gave it to colleges, but they're gone, is the point. So we decided here about 2 years ago, went down to the National Association of Broadcasters, and because all of us who are interested in broadcasting are interested in sound as a contribution to the body of human knowledge, that there should be some way of trying to find out. Now, for instance, right here today, we're talking here on the radio. There may be some people listening right now who have upstairs in the attic here someplace in Maine some old recordings, some old cylinders that they had on the old phonograph or the gramophone that are lost as far as society is concerned, that nobody even knows where they exist. A fella called me and said that during World War I, he had been asked by the government to go out to the end of Long Island, out of Montauk Point, and try to monitor some German stations that were sending codes, they thought, across to submarines. And he took his little old phonograph out there with the Edison cylinders on it, the old wax cylinders, and he recorded these code signals coming in from Germany. He probably is the only one who has that particular, let's say, sound recorded of all the people on Earth. There was a man on Staten Island who has, in the old days, if you remember the old aluminum discs,
Yes.
when they used a thorn needle to make the sound, this fellow went down one day when Coolidge was making a political speech running for president, and he took his recorder out and recorded this campaign speech of Calvin Coolidge's. He probably is the only man on Earth who has that particular speech recorded. Edison recorded P.T. Barnum one time in London, back in about 1885 or 90. Florence Nightingale was recorded. Robert Browning, they have even a recording of his voice. There are many people, that's right, but much of it has been lost. And so, through the National Association of Broadcasters, we went to work on a project beginning about 2 years ago, and we're just started in it yet, trying to find the location of all the what we call significant sound, and that means historic sound or important current sound that has been saved all over United States. And we're hoping now, I'll say right here, that if you have any listeners who have any very old collector's item recordings, or who made some very early tape recordings, or who made some old wax recordings, who have important sound recorded in the past, we'd like very much to know about it. Or likewise, there are people right here in Maine. Someone was telling me the other day that there was, up until at least very recently, maybe still here, the last living member of the Shaker colony. And that this old gentleman was over 90, and pretty soon he would be gone. And I'm inclined to feel that if he still is living, that nobody has ever recorded one word from him. And I hope that somebody will take his tape recorder, find this man, that they will find fishermen along the Maine coast. There must be stories. There must be people who have interesting stories, and the old legends of the old fishermen. There may be, for instance, on board ship, we had not long ago the oldest living survivor of the sinking of the Titanic. We were able to record some of her talk and description and recollections. There may have been some great dramatic scenes here along the seacoast. There were a number of great sea stories told here, and if some of the witnesses of those would take a few minutes and recall and retell some of those stories, it would be material that will be gone, and that society would love to have, not only next year, but 50 years from now.
Well, as broadcasters, of course, we're interested in that. In fact, you did a poll of a lot of stations, the NAB did, and what was the reaction from broadcasters?
Every one of the stations were interested, but you'd be amazed, Norm, how few have any sound.
Materials, yeah.
They just haven't collected it, or maybe they didn't think of it, or maybe it was collected and gone or wiped off. It was tape. and therefore we're having to depend on the people
The general
themselves.
public.
That's
huh?
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I know a friend who's got quite a collection. In fact, when this first came in from the NAB, I alerted him. I said, "The time may come when we may call on you for
That's
this type
right.
of thing." And this is truly a fascinating thing. We're running out of time, but before we go, I want to ask you this, Ted. Did you ever get in television?
Oh, I had a little fun in that old picture tube, but not a great deal. I did a show out in Cleveland for 2 years. It's too hard work, Norm. I like it better this way. And also, just between us, on radio, if they've never seen you, now there must be somebody who's listening now who thinks that you and I are tall, handsome men with curly hair.
Don't spoil the illusion.
That's
huh?
right. That's right. On television, they find out. Well, my parents were disappointed too. They expected a girl, but they got used to it, and my wife's getting used to it gradually, and most of my friends get used to it. But I still like to keep as many people thinking that it's
Imagery.
That's right. And that 21-inch tube or that 15-inch tube or any other one.
It's a shocker.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Ted, this is something that's interesting. I think too that broadcasting is perhaps radio is much more fascinating than television, because in your particular case, for instance, you're able to go and search out all of these things, which are all have to do with sound.
That's right.
And you haven't got this problem of schedules. They got to be live and this type of thing. This tapes today provide this opportunity to do other things while you're still at the same time
That's
performing too. Huh?
Carlton Brown and I went up around Newfoundland and had a wonderful week up there on a little tiny ship, and we were able to go down and record the codfish fishermen in their boats. We could go down under the decks where the fellows were coming back from a summer fishing, and they're playing their accordion and singing their old songs of the Outer Banks. There were so many stories that you can pick up in things like that and bring back to a microphone that can still be imagined by the listener.
Right.
No,
Great.
I love radio. Radio's my field.
Well, Ted Malone, we've enjoyed having you here tremendously. If you're back in Maine before too long, maybe we can have you back for a return visit, huh?
I never go very far away from Maine in my heart.
Well, good. It's been fun having you on the show this morning, Ted Malone, and many thanks for coming in, and we look forward to another broadcast.
Thanks for the opportunity, Norm.
This concludes Talkback for another morning. These programs are presented 5 days a week as an area service of your friends and neighbors at the Edwards Division of the Bates Manufacturing Company. You're invited to join us again tomorrow morning at 9:35. This is Norm Gallant speaking for your friends and neighbors at the Edwards Division of the Bates Manufacturing Company, and this is your main attraction.